Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful that we can be here together, online mostly. We're thankful for the people that can be here in person. And we just ask that your Holy Spirit can be our teacher. We know, Lord, that this is an important topic at this time, as we're 41 days away from July 18th, 2020, and we feel that we don't really understand this message. Help us to understand the things we study. May you guide us and direct our thoughts. Help me in my presentation to understand these things and to communicate clearly, and help people to have a clear understanding as they study these things, as we all study these things together. We pray for each person. We know, Lord, that there are many trials ahead, and we just ask for strength and help, and that we can look to you. We pray this and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So as a quick review of what we've been studying in the context of the structure of prophetic chronology, as we're now going through the lines at the end of the world. And specifically, we've dealt with, and there's some overlap on these studies with the studies we're doing on Thursdays dealing with Daniel 11. But here we're trying to really focus upon the lines themselves, and we've gone through the first angel's message and part of the second angel's message, and we're now going to look at the midnight cry. But I want to review this idea of how these lines are connected. So we know that there's this period of darkness in 1798. There's the time of the end. And the time of the end marks a period of an increase of light. And we have marked that the first angel arrives in 1798. And it arrives to give this light. And then there's a formalization of the message in 1833. And then there's an empowerment of the message on August 11th, 1840.
Excuse me, Theodore.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you move the camera up a bit?
Okay, so it's not up high enough there. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we would have the first angel is formalized, and then the first angel is empowered. And we went through this history, a little bit about the first angel's message, to understand what it was. But it's the message that God's judgment is coming. And we read some of the understanding from the Millerite writings on this first angel's message of how they understood it. Now, we know that there was then the arrival of the second angel, which I'm going to put here, on April 19th, 1844. So the second angel is going to arrive here. And then we're going to have the second angel is going to be formalized. And this hasn't well been understood of how we look at this. And then the second angel is empowered. So I would put this as July 21st, 1844. And this would be the 5th day of the 4th month. This was the first day of the first month. And then it would be empowered on August 15th, 1844, on the first day of the 5th month. And then we would have the third angel arrive. Arrives. It's not empowered. On the 10th day of the 7th month, which is October 22, 1844. And so in this history, we've dealt with the first and second angel's message. We've started to address the midnight cry a little bit, but we're going to look at this a little bit more. We also studied Samuel Snow's letters to some degree, but we're going to look at them in a little bit more detail and context of the midnight cry. So this we call the first disappointment. I know this is all review. Midnight, and this is Boston. And this is the midnight cry. This is Exeter. And this is the great disappointment. So you got the first disappointment and the great disappointment. Now, Ellen White talks about that the third angel arrives here on October 22nd, 1844, and it continues to the end of time. And that it's going to be joined with another angel. And that other angel is the angel of Revelation 18. Now, we would say that this is the first three angels' messages are in Revelation 14. But in Revelation 18, and we've looked at this in different ways and trying to understand our history. But we would just, for a simple way of looking at it, we have the third angel is continuing, and then it's going to be joined by a fourth. So it's going to be joined. I should have this arrow coming down like this. So this is, and this we put at 9/11. So you're going to have the fourth angel is going to come and join the third angel, however you want to look at that, illustrate it. Now, in order for there to be this angel here to arrive, because this angel, the fourth, is the second angel. It's Babylon is fallen. And we know that in this history, and we didn't really address this too much, we're going to address this a little bit more as well as part of the second angel's message. But we know that Protestantism had a partial fall here, and it's going to have a larger fall as time goes on. And this second angel, when it arrives, which is the fourth angel, it's the second angel, it's going to swell into a loud cry. And that loud cry is Babylon is fallen, come out of her, my people. Right? So this, in this history, if you look under the first and second and third angel's messages, even though there's a fall of Babylon in the second angel's message, there's no call to come out of Babylon in Revelation 14 itself. The Millerites, though, believe that there was. So they looked at Revelation 18 as just amplifying Revelation 14. So they believe that they were to call people out of Babylon. But in reality, the second angel's message says nothing about calling them out of Babylon. It merely says Babylon is fallen, In this history, Babylon again is fallen, but the call to come out of her, my people, happens under this other angel. So Ellen White says that this is going to happen in this history. Now, she doesn't say that it's going to happen at 9/11. We mark it there because at 9/11, we saw this. So let's try to put our line here. So we have a period of darkness in our history, and that period of darkness is the result of what happens between October 22nd, 1844 and 1989. So we'll just put 1989 here. 1989 we know is the time of the end for our generation. And there's 4 generations of Adventism, and it develops into a period of darkness. So there's darkness here. And then we need a reform line. So this reform line, even though we can take it and lay it over top here, is still a part of this reform line. So this reform line of the Millerites, we're still part of that reform line. We are just the fourth angel, the fourth waymark, because each of the reform lines has 3 plus 1. And that plus 1 is this area here. So when we put 1989 as the time of the end, we're not creating a new dispensation in the sense that a Protestant would think of it. We are actually continuing this reform line. And so 1989 is the time of the end, but that time of the end is connected to this time of the end. And then we know that we're going to have a formalization of the message in 1996. And then we're going to have this message empowered at 9/11. So I didn't put that formalization in here, but I'm putting it here. Now, the thing about 9/11 is we recognize that it connects to August 11th, 1840. That is, that's the first angel arrives, first angel is formalized, and then the first angel is empowered. But in our history, we recognized also, as time went on, that 9/11 also was the arrival of the second angel's message. And the reason is this is the arrival of the fourth angel, which is the second angel. So obviously the second angel arrived here at 9/11. In Millerite history, these are two separate events, August 11th, 1840 and April 19th. But in our history, we see that these two events come together. And the reason that we put them together, there's a number of reasons, but the main reason to me had to do with the fact that when Revelation 18 is fulfilled at 9/11, it's also the second angel. So the empowerment of the first angel and the arrival occur at a separate time in Millerite history, but they occur at the same time. This becomes one waymark in our history. Now, we're going to deal with all this a bit later, but I still think that this is an important point that isn't well understood, because there was a lot of confusion regarding this. Now, one of the things that I brought out is that the Millerites in this history believe that they were giving the midnight cry between August 11th and April 19th. But that midnight cry that they gave was not the true midnight cry. That true midnight cry was given by Samuel Snow, first at Boston, then at Exeter, and then it was published in August 22, 1840, in a periodical. I guess it wouldn't be a periodical, it was just a one-time publishing of the True Midnight Cry. Well, actually, they did republish it on October 3rd. But anyway, it was just a paper that was published. So in this history, we also noticed that there was two different groups. We had a group called the Protestants, who were given this opportunity to accept the message, the first angel's message, and they had completely rejected that by April 19th, except this group that we would call the Millerites. So the Millerites then are going to go through a tarrying time, and in that tarrying time, they're going to come to this point here. And when the third angel arrives, some of the Millerites, not very many, are going to accept this third angel's message. So some people accepted the first angel's message but failed the test on April 19th. And that's why the second angel arrives here. And then some Millerites accepted the second angel's message, but then failed the test. So Protestants accept the first angel's message, some of them. The ones that pass, that become what we would call the Millerites, then they accept the second angel's message. And then when the third angel arrives, only a very small group, maybe about 50 people initially, accept the three angels' messages, or the three angels' message. And they go on to receive further light. So that history here, and if anybody has any questions, I'm just going to add some of this history here. We know that in this history, there's also, just like there's going to be a first and a second and a third, there's also a fourth. But in that initial history, that fourth is going to be a failure. That is, the fourth is going to arrive. The work should be accomplished here in this history, but it isn't accomplished. And this is in the first generation that this fourth angel comes and fails. So, and this fourth is supposed to empower the third. But instead, you'll see, and I'm just going to mark these waymarks here, 1850, whoops, not 1580, 1850, 1863, and 1888. And this is a rejection of the first angel's message, a rejection of the second angel's message, and a rejection of the third angel's message. Now, I put 1850, you could say 1851. But here in this history, this was meant to be the accomplishment of the work. If the vast majority, or maybe a larger portion of the Millerites had accepted the third angel's message, if we had had the machinery that had given the first and second angel's message, if it was able to give the third angel's message, if it would have been understood, and ifs are big things, because they didn't happen, but if it had, this work could have been completed in here. We would have had the fourth angel arrive, and it would have empowered the third angel, and in 1888, that message would have been accepted. But it wasn't accepted, it was rejected. Because the first and second had been rejected, the third was rejected. Now, I've also paralleled this, I'm going to draw this in very small here, but we know there's also, at the beginning of the 2300 days, this here. At the beginning of the 2300 days, you have Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes' decree, and you have the 2300 days begin. So this is a very short 2300 days. And then you're going to have this reform line here in Millerite history at the end of the 2300 days. But you're also going to have the fourth decree. This is Artaxerxes' second decree, under which Nehemiah completed the streets and walls. And this is in the first generation. And it sets up even what happens here with Ezra and Nehemiah, dealing with being married to strange women and the Sabbath. These become a stumbling block. Even though these are true reforms, they become a stumbling block for the Jews in the time of Christ. Now, in the time of Christ, here, maybe I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to put the 70 weeks here first. Then I'm going to put the 2300 days. So in the time of Christ, you're going to have this progressive destruction of four. When you get to the Christ reform line here, with the birth of Christ, there's already a period of darkness. We know that from the Bible, that it says when people talks about the darkness, it's in Isaiah, they saw a great light. Them that dwelt in darkness have seen a great light. I can't remember the passage. But there's lots of evidence that there's this period of darkness. But that period of darkness starts in this first generation. Isaiah what?
I thought it was Isaiah 36.
Isaiah 36, someone says whether that's what it is. But then we know that there's a reform line here. And the reform line of Christ is an important reform line. We're not even really addressing it, though, in any sort of detail. But the reform line of Christ becomes the key that unlocks all reform lines. Now, we say that the Millerite line is the main line. It is, in another sense. That is, it's in the Millerite time period that we start to see all these lines come together, and especially comes together in our time period. But the pattern of Christ's reform line is the most important reform line, in my view. Now, so this 70 weeks here, 490 years, ends with a reform line. So this reform line here also has this period of progressive destruction of four. And we can see that Christ's reform line is actually completing the work that was done here. Now, this, of course, is dealing with the original, the rebuilding of the temple, the second temple. But Christ is actually the temple, right? The work that he does, where he comes and dwells in tabernacles with men, is the key that unlocks all prophecy. Now, we know, of course, this three decrees start the 2300 days, and this reform line ends the 2300 days. Yet this reform line here is a unique reform line. It parallels this reform line. It parallels the reform line of Christ. But this pattern also with our reform line is connected just in the same way that the reform line of Christ is connected to this one. So we have all these reform lines that are connected in various ways. We can go all the way back to creation and look at all these reform lines if we have the time, which we don't. But what we can know is that in this reform line that we are in, the work that Christ did here in dying on the cross is going to be manifest in his people at the end of the world. And we sometimes lose sight of that, because what we're focusing on upon a lot is trying to figure out these reform lines, what's going to happen in the future. We're thinking about chronology, we're thinking about timelines. But we need to understand what that work is. And that's the completed work of Christ. When Jesus came and died for our sins, he demonstrated to the universe that humanity could overcome sin with God's power. But we now need a demonstration of that, not just in Christ, but in his people. And this reform line here that we're in is the reform line of the 144,000. And the reform line of the 144,000 is all of the reform lines put together. But the main purpose of this reform line is to demonstrate Christ's character, and it resolves all of the issues of the great controversy. So it's a pretty amazing time to be living in, because we're not just living in some normal time. We're living in a time where God is going to be doing an amazing work, which would be equal to, or maybe even greater, than when he brought the Israelites out of Egypt. It's an amazing time to be in. So this period of time that we're in, we want to understand it. Now, in order to understand it, we really need to understand this reform line. And so that's what we've been taking our time to do. We need to understand the Millerite reform line. And I think we also need to understand the reform line of Christ, its purposes. Now, in this reform line here, as I said, we have these different groups of people. And that's one of the things about our reform line that has become confusing, because we have lots of different groups of people. We have the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and we have divided that into two classes called priests and Levites. And then we have this other group, which we refer to as the Nethinim. We've also referred to 11th hour workers, and that's been confusing. Some people have equated them with the Nethinim. I'm not sure why, because I would think each group has 11th hour workers. But we also talked about the line of the 144,000. And we're not really clear what group that is. At least I don't think it's been made clear to me, listening to all the different presentations, who we are, who are these different groups, and especially who we are. Now, if we look in this history, we said that there's Protestants, and then there's Millerites. And the Millerites are then going to go on, and there's going to be this other group that results, which is the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I don't think we've well defined who the Protestants are. And you would think we would know what the Protestants are in this history, but how they relate to this history. So what do the Protestants represent in this history? And then we also have the Millerites. Well, who do the Millerites represent in this history? And then we have the Seventh-day Adventists who start this here in this history. Well, who are they in this history? But we also have someone else in this history. We have Samuel Snow. We have prophets, and prophets also symbolize things. We know we have Josiah Litch. He has a purpose in this history as an individual, which he symbolizes something in this history. We have William Miller as an individual. So we have Millerites, but we also have Miller. And we have Samuel Snow. And then we're going to have James and Ellen White as well in this history. And they all symbolize something. What we've tried to do is we've tried to make them symbolize individuals or people. And they can't possibly do that. In our line, they can symbolize messages, but no individual person in and of themselves can be symbolized by any of these people. Now, some people have known that we've done that. We've made Jeff Miller. Now, Jeff fulfills a role in this history here, because he's the one who, in 1989, begins studying lineup online. In 1996, he's the one who publishes the Time of the End magazine. And so we know that he's the one who's developed this first angel's message. But when it comes down to our history, Jeff is not Miller. And when Jeff tried to pass the baton, so to speak, he actually had no right to do so, because as an individual, he didn't have that right. He symbolized this work because of the message that he gave. But as an individual person, he's no different than you or I. He has a great more knowledge than we do. But as far as his role only exists when he's doing a specific work. And so some people have come along through the times in this message and claimed to be Samuel Snow, sometimes hinted at it, sometimes were quite bold about it. But there's no reason that we would expect a single person to be Samuel Snow. Samuel Snow has a specific message. And so we need to know in our history who Samuel Snow or what Samuel Snow represents. We also have Josiah Litch. Now, Josiah Litch is separate from Miller, and he has a different work than Miller. And we haven't even really tried to decide who Josiah Litch represents. It's been hinted at, but it's not been fully understood. We also, of course, we have James White and Ellen White. And I've seen people do studies where they've tried to, and this was a while ago, where they tried to say who the next person was going to be after Jeff based upon this model that we had Miller, and then we had James and Ellen White. And some of those ideas were used by the new movement to actually exalt Parminder and Tess as being the leaders of this movement, so that they have passed, in a sense, into what they believe would be this history, though it's very confusing how they understand that. So they make Parminder and Tess sort of prophets, similar to James and Ellen White in their roles. So we're confused, I think we are, in trying to understand our line. And that's because confusion has been brought in. So what we're doing is we're going to go back again, and we're going to look at the second angel's message in a little bit more detail, and look at the midnight cry, what the midnight cry was supposed to accomplish. And then we're going to try to understand how this relates to our line. So, any questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I welcome questions. It lets me know.
Well, you
Where
said
we
that we have to decide who Samuel Snow does not represent a person, but then you said Samuel Litch.
Josiah Litch.
You said we have to decide what his role was as a person. How do you
Right.
decide whether a person doesn't represent a person and the
Yeah.
other person represents?
Okay, I understand the
a
question.
person?
So what I mean is we need to understand what he represents in this history to know what he represents in our history. I don't think it's a person. So we're not looking for a person in our history, but we need to know what Josiah Litch is representing. We need to know what Samuel Snow is representing. We need to know what the Protestants are representing. We need to know what the Millerites are representing. If we're going to understand our lines clearly, we need to understand this history clearly. And I don't think that we do. And I would include myself in that, is I don't think we fully understand our lines. Now, it doesn't mean that we are not being led by God or that we're not doing the work that God asks us to do. But I think it gives us confusion in regard to what's coming. And it's definitely created confusion for many, many people who have left this message, because we had so much confusion regarding what these different people represented, making them represent people, that it led many people astray. And so we have to really be clear about this as we look at this history.
Say,
Yes, somebody has a question.
I have a comment. It looks like to me, as you've gone through this, that this, and I'm probably stating the obvious,
Yeah.
is that this is a whole line of reformations or reforms that God intended for man to go through and it would ended with the SDA in the 144,000, but they rejected it. And so now it's like kind of a partial repeat, beginning with 1989.
Right. And see, we can take the reform lines all the way back to creation. Right from the beginning. In the beginning, it's the time of the beginning, not the time of the end. But you're going to have darkness, and you're going to have an increase of light. God says, "Let there be light," and you're going to have all those messages symbolized by the acts of creation. I've done this study before. It's actually was recorded but lost. Unfortunately, Stephen recorded it, and I believe that it didn't. We weren't able to save it back in 2016. But this is something that has just not been done in this message. I've personally done the study going through all the reform lines and connecting them all. What I believe happened is, with the origin of sin, is man went into darkness. And God has throughout history continually been bringing light to his people in a progressive way. But every time there's a reform line, there's also a failure. And there's a new darkness that arises. And all of these histories, all these things were written as examples for us upon whom the end of the world has come. They're types. And we now have the effect of every vision. And what this allows us to do is to look at all truth, everything that God has tried to reveal to mankind. We are supposed to understand those things at the end of the world, because the 144,000 who are going to demonstrate Christ's character have a different experience than individuals in the past. That is, they're going to go through the time of Jacob's trouble. They're going to have to stand in the sight of a holy God without a mediator. And the experience that Christ experienced on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" He said, that same cry will go from the lips of the 144,000. And yet they will demonstrate, when God says at the close of probation, "Let him that is just be just still, and let him that is unjust be unjust still." The wicked are not going to change from their wickedness, but the righteous won't depart from that righteousness. God is going to declare what is. He's not going to do some magic to make people not sin. He has just done it through the power of his word, so that people have no trust in self and a complete dependence upon God, so that even without feeling God's presence, even though they cannot see themselves as righteous, they will still stand for God and endure that trial. And I believe that's why a number is literal. It's 144,000 in number. And they will demonstrate something that it's the standard that Jesus has set of how many people he needs to demonstrate his character, to make the universe forever secure from sin ever rising the second time. And if we lose sight of this issue of the great controversy and get bogged down in trying to understand details, when we don't understand the big picture, I think we're making a grave mistake. And I think we've done that. We've made that mistake over and over again. Many people who have been in this message have fallen away. And they've fallen away because they don't understand the first principles of the oracles of God. They're trying to understand advanced truths when in their personal life, they have no real connection with Christ. They have no real understanding of the gospel. And now we could say that that's a neglect on the part of the leadership of this movement. Some people have tried to criticize the leadership in that sense, but I don't think that's the problem, because we, as Seventh-day Adventists, we have this light. There's no excuse for a Seventh-day Adventist who has ever read The Desire of Ages to not know the gospel. And if you haven't read The Desire of Ages, you cannot call yourself a Seventh-day Adventist. If you haven't read The Great Controversy, if you haven't read and studied Ellen White's writings, you're not a Seventh-day Adventist, even though you profess to believe advanced truths. And we saw even in this movement, people came in and started teaching error, and nobody was even really aware of it. One is, it was done in a deceptive way. So when I approached him and said, what is it you're teaching? He would just say he agreed with me. But of course, we know that was a lie. And but it planted a seed that reaped a harvest of all those people who thought they knew what it meant to overcome sin. When I asked them, it wasn't me actually personally asking them, somebody else asked them, are you sinning? Are you a sinner? And they would claim that they don't sin. I know that that person does not understand the gospel. Those that are seeking to profess perfect Christian character will never indulge the thought that they are sinless, even though their lives may be irreproachable, because the closer they come to Christ, the more sinful they appear in their own eyes, and the more clearly they see their defects.
Hey, Brother
So-
Theodore.
What's that?
Hey, how are you? This is Emmanuel.
Yeah.
I just wanted, I didn't mean to cut you
That's
off
okay.
there, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for that thoughtful, articulate wording of the gospel. I appreciate that, and I think it should be talked of more. I don't think that it is just the responsibility of the leadership to share what you just shared, but I do, when I hear it being shared, it's a breath of fresh air that kind of brings everything back to a common center and says, stop all the madness, come back to the cross, and begin again afresh.
Yeah.
And I appreciate what you said.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, I have presented this message probably starting in the mid-'80s, presenting it at my regular church for years and years, sermon after sermon, talking about it in Sabbath school. And Jones and Wagner presented this message, but it never accomplished the work that it was supposed to do. That is, we can talk all we want about righteousness by faith. It's not going to produce righteousness by faith. And one thing we see in this message that was not clear to me in the past is that the reason the 1888 message was rejected was because the first and second angels' messages were rejected. It's the first and second angels' messages, it's the prophecies that actually empower the gospel. You can talk about Christ's love and his love for you. You can talk about the nature of Christ, how we should overcome sin and the way that Christ overcame sin. But the thing that actually empowers us is recognizing fulfilled prophecy. There's nothing more powerful or convicting that you are a sinner when you're in the midst of prophecy being fulfilled and you see that God's word is true. That's what empowers the gospel. So this message has always been a prophetic message. It's always been about prophecy. And many people have come time and time again into this message trying to turn the message to righteousness by faith. And I think that that was a mistake. I don't think you can do that because every Seventh-day Adventist knows righteousness by faith. Intellectually, we should know it.
Hey,
But
Brother Theodore.
Seventh-day Adventists don't do it. And the reason they don't do it is because there's no power attended to it. You can't talk about the love of Christ if you don't know who Christ is. And you can't know who Christ is unless you understand prophecy. And so it's prophecy that empowers the Christian life.
Brother Theodore.
Yeah.
Just one more point.
Yeah.
This is kind of like maybe a time where we could take up this discussion at another time, because I think this is really important to actually discuss. I would say this, and not to disagree publicly or anything like that. I would say that what you're saying is true, but detached from the message of prophecy, it's not full. It's not the whole picture.
Mhm.
Prophecy is very important. But one of the major parts of prophecy is to bring us to God, and for us to cry out, what must I do to be saved? That's one of the elements of prophecy. And then once we understand that, there is not just this thing that we're now, okay, prophecy tells us and now we're saved. No, there's a message that brings us to what is the gospel? What is this plan of salvation? What does it mean that God loves us? What does it mean that that is a propitiation? And you begin to understand the technicalities of the gospel, and that may not be prophecy, but the plan of salvation is something we're going to study to the ceaseless ages of eternity. If there's anything that is said to be a word that is more important then the plan of salvation, not just the word prophecy, but the plan, the actual plan that saves man from their condition, what God does and what man must do, the covenant relationship between God, if those are not clearly defined, then surely prophecy alone is it doesn't keep up.
Well, nobody said prophecy alone.
Amen.
I'm just saying that every Seventh-day Adventist already knows the gospel.
That's not true.
If you've read, well, I disagree, because if you've read Desire of Ages, you've heard the gospel expressed in such clear tones that there's no excuse for you to
No.
say that you don't know the gospel. What I've seen happen in Adventism through my years is people bring in other things that they think is the gospel. The 1888 Message Study Committee did many good things, but they brought in false ideas to the understanding of the gospel. When people see 1888 as a success, when they see that what we need to do is just present Jones and Wagner's messages, they fail to take into account that Jones and Wagner fell away. It doesn't mean that they were teaching error. It just means that there was something lacking. Most Seventh-day Adventists are going to know, if they've studied it all, they're going to know what Jones and Wagner said. The problem is they can't do it. Just like Jones and Wagner couldn't do it. They couldn't practice righteousness by faith. So the problem isn't an intellectual one regarding the understanding of righteousness by faith. The problem is that we're not truly convicted on our own sin, and we're not truly convicted on God's power to overcome sin. And it's prophecy that gives us that. And every time somebody has come into this message to try to preach righteousness by faith, they have all fallen away. They weren't pushed out. They fell away, some into great darkness. So those people, they had an intellectual understanding of righteousness by faith, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was they thought that that was the gospel, and it's not. The gospel is the revelation of Jesus Christ in his people. And in the only way that that gospel can be understood is not by some clear presentation, because those clear presentations have been done again and again and again. The only way that message will be clear is when it's actually practiced by us. When we actually reflect Christ's character, then Jesus can come. And we're not going to reflect Christ's character if we don't understand prophecy. And it's not just an intellectual understanding of prophecy, it's actually living through that prophecy, having that conviction of sin. And that's what this message has done. For those who have seen it, it has transformed their lives. And that's what we need. And that's why we focus upon prophecy, because that's the message that God has given us. If you look at Millerite history does not focus upon what we would call the gospel. It focused upon prophecy. That was their role. But when the third angel arrived in 1844, at the close of probation, that's when the third angel arrives in our history. In that sense, it's already been here because it arrived on October 22nd, 1844. But when God says, let him that is righteous be righteous still, let him that is filthy be filthy still, that is the third angel's message. And when God closes probation, we will see what Jesus has talked about, living that Christian life. We will see it manifest in his people as a witness to the entire universe that what Jesus did on the cross was effective.
Hey,
It
Brother
actually
Theodore.
accomplished what he came to do. But until that happens,
Brother
you're
Theodore.
not going to see, you might see it in individuals here and there, but you're not going to see it manifest until probation closes. So that's the arrival of the third angel's message.
Brother
I'm
Theodore,
sort
can
of
you hear me?
pointing you ahead to where we're going. Yes, you have another comment?
Yeah. How much time did you spend studying the message of righteousness by faith and presenting it and preaching it?
Well, I read everything that Jones and Wagner wrote, probably much of their books several times. I read the 1888 messages, 1888 book on Ellen White's, plus also all the letters that were written at that time. And I probably presented hundreds of sermons on righteousness by faith, plus taught it in Sabbath school for over 20 years.
My second question to that would be, how many people in the prophetic movement do you think has that type of breadth of understanding
Well,
of the message of righteous faith that you have. I say that to say that what you're saying is true if you have that foundational understanding as your
thing is,
core.
all
There's a
I
lot
need,
of people that don't have that here, Brother Theodore. That's the truth.
that's true. But the thing is, I understood it when I read the book Desire of Ages. And that was, I was just a new Adventist. And from there, I could continue to study it. My point is, no matter how many times I studied it, no matter how many times it was presented, it was still powerless. That's my point. So even somebody like me who studied it all those years, I still fell away. So understanding righteousness by faith isn't enough. We need to understand prophecy. Sure, there's many people who
Brother
don't
Theodore,
understand righteousness by faith in the way that,
Brother
they
Theodore,
don't know all this history, but that's not going to save them. That's my point. No matter
fine.
how much you study, you're not going to have the power to overcome sin. You're not going to see yourself as a
Brother
sinner.
Theodore,
Yes.
Brother Theodore, maybe we can have maybe a one-on-one afterwards, but I just want to say one more point and I'm going to leave the conversation alone.
Okay.
So we can, but I would like to talk about this afterwards because I think it's very important. I see that you're adamant about it. My forehead is also flint here. When you say that you studied righteous by faith and prophecy, I agree. Now, if somebody studies prophecy but doesn't have a breadth of understanding of righteous by faith, we also have to agree that no matter how much prophetic understanding a person gains without righteousness by faith as an understanding intellectually as well, they will also not come up to the measure of the 144,000. If we can agree there.
I disagree with you there.
Okay, then I would love to talk about this
I
after.
disagree because I've seen it change people without it. You
Okay,
can't
fair
separate either one, prophecy and righteousness. Yes, you can't separate them. But I'm saying that if you want to know who Christ is, Ellen White says we need to present him in types and symbols. You cannot know Christ apart from prophecy. And if you study prophecy and you come to know Christ, you will experience righteousness by faith, even if you don't have a complete intellectual understanding of it. That is the problem. Their intellectual understanding of righteousness by faith can't make you righteous. But it doesn't take much to know. I mean, I know people who are very simple. They don't have a great deal of understanding. They can't read books and remember everything. But they can live righteousness by faith. And they may not even express it correctly. They may not have the language skills or the words or the knowledge, but they can live righteousness by faith without understanding all of the intellectual language and all the fine points and arguments. And that's been the problem in Adventism, is people have been arguing about righteousness by faith instead of living righteousness by faith. And so that's my point. If you study prophecy, God will lead you. Righteousness by faith is not the most difficult part of the Christian experience. It depends. Of course, it depends what you mean by that. But what I'm saying is the gospel is clear throughout the scriptures. You read Spirit of Prophecy, she explains the gospel. But when Jones and Wagner came and started presenting the 1888 message, many people didn't even recognize it was the gospel. And that's not because they hadn't heard the gospel. It's because they had put other things in its place. It's because they weren't converted. When you're not converted, you're going to reject the light. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not comprehend it. And that's the problem. So in order to be saved, you have to come to that light. And the only way you can come to that light and approach it is through prophecy. You can't approach it through discussing the nature of Christ and the love of Christ. It just doesn't work. Because that's what I made my point.
This is not
I studied
true,
this,
Brother
I could
Theodore.
explain
It's
it
not
clearly.
true what you're saying.
Excuse me.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
This, and I could explain it clearly.
Brother
And
Theodore.
nobody was affected or changed by it, including myself. Yeah.
Brother Theodore, 14 years ago when I met the Lord, I was invited to church by a person who's super famous in Africa now. She left the church since. And when I found the Lord, I had a Paul conversion. In a matter of a week, I was a different person, changed altogether, a different person. That I did not hear anything in regard to prophecy when that happened. So my stance on this is also not just experience, but also that the love of God actually does convert the soul. It
And I'm not
actually
disagreeing
does.
with that. I came converted without understanding prophecy too.
Okay.
The
Oh,
point is
please.
that didn't
Thank you.
continue. There was no
Oh,
pathway
praise
there.
the Lord.
Sure, and for
Yeah.
a short time, you can come there. You can
Okay.
you keep
Amen.
experiencing Christ because God, the Holy Spirit, works on all hearts. But without prophecy, there's no way that I could continue to see myself as I truly was. And that's my point. That without prophecy, you're not going to get the 144,000. The 144,000 aren't the result of people talking about righteousness by faith. They're the result of being participants in fulfilled prophecy and understanding and accepting prophecy and walking by faith in these prophecies. The reason why they can stand in the sight of the holy God without a mediator, sure, they know Christ, but also they know the prophecies. And they know, because they know the prophecies, they know who they are. And they can see that they're sinners. They don't see themselves as righteous. And I know that this is a difficult conversation because it's a big problem in Adventism. And it's always been a big problem in this message. People have always come to this message and claim that the problem is we don't know righteousness by faith. And that's not the problem. The problem is we do know it, but we don't do it. And so we're going to leave that part of the conversation maybe some other time. I'm not going to have time today to talk about it because I have to go to work after this. But anyway, you can see where we're at in this context of this message, where I'm saying that we need the first and second angel's message, because you can't have the third without the first and the second. And the first and second angel's messages are prophetic messages. The third angel's message is righteousness by faith. The first angel's message isn't. The second angel's message isn't. The third angel's message is righteousness by faith and verity. And when she says that, I believe that she's talking about it's actually being lived in verity, in reality, not something that's just in words. So we're going to look at some papers here. So I'm going to have to share them on here. But thanks for that conversation. I know I'm a little bit stubborn on this topic because I think it's something that, it's been my study for so long. Now, see if I can find it on this computer. Okay, yeah, I can. Okay, there it is. I'm not too happy using this computer to do this. Doesn't work as well, but so we're going to look at the Three Angels Messages source book, and this is very tiny, so I'm going to have to make this bigger. And be nice if you guys could see this, but you can't. I don't like this. Now, the Three Angels Messages source book is, I'm going to do this. It's just a compilation of all the first, second, and third angels' messages, the Midnight Cry, and the studies on the daily from Millerite history. So, me.
We gave you a copy of it.
Okay, that's not going to work. Okay, so this is an old copy of the Three Angels Messages source book. So it might have some typos in it, but that's the best I can do right at the moment. So many of you have this, the Three Angels Messages source book. You've gotten it from the internet, or you got it from me as an email. And um, we touched on Samuel Snow's letters, so we kind of jumped ahead a little bit. But where I want to go to here is some things regarding the second main angel's message. So that's the midnight cry. And so here's what I want to deal with. So now this is from Second Advent Waymarks and High Heaps by Joseph Bates. And Joseph Bates always has some very interesting insights. So this is his take regarding the second angel's message. He calls it the third waymark. So it's interesting, and I recommend that everybody read this book, Second Advent Waymarks and High Heaps. Joseph Bates has some interesting ideas. They're not always correct, but they are interesting. And so he marks out what he calls the waymarks. So this he calls the third waymark, the fall of Babylon. And this is what I want to focus on today, is to understanding the Protestants, who they are. And there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. So he says, she has made all the world drink from the cup of poison, Revelation 7, verse 14. Hence, as John says, the inhabitants of the earth are made drunk, and the only remedy pointed out by God to heal his people of this awful malady and make them sober again is to come out of her altogether. For while you stay there, you will be continually drunk with her poison. And of course, you can see Joseph Bates is a kind of a colorful character in the way that he words things. So he says, I feel that I have now come to a waymark which has been represented under so many false colorings by the majority of these messengers, making it very difficult for all the honest-hearted to keep their eyes upon it long enough to be so fully satisfied of its identity, that I need wisdom from God to direct, and by his help I will try not to go all over the ground, which has been ably done by the minority, but touch some of the points and show it fulfilled as it stands in our pathway. I at first supposed that this should be called the second waymark instead of the tarrying time, but I think it will be seen where I have placed it by the time I have described the fifth waymark. It is true, it began to be seen before the second one, but its prominency was not fully discovered until we had passed the most trying part of the tarrying time. And there followed another angel. That is, during this judgment hour cry, some of the messengers, with others that had been joining the ranks, commenced the second message, saying, as in the text, Babylon is fallen. Many of the prominent and leading angels or messengers utterly rejected this message, while others were burdened and pain to be delivered. This message began to be heard in the fall of 1843 and increased in proportion to the first, down to the tarrying time. Here the subject began to be pretty thoroughly discussed, but still a great number of virgins could not or would not understand it on account of the difference of opinion among messengers. Not that any of them doubted the message being given, for that could not be disputed any more than the first, but what the scriptural meaning of the fall of Babylon was. As the Advent shield was introduced here in the tarrying time for the special purpose, and that's a periodical, of reviewing all the past so that our standard may be perfect and clear, this subject was canvassed under their fourth, the fourth article, page 112, what is Babylon? And what is the fall of Babylon? The answer on page 119 and 120, that Babylon is the world, and that her fall, the coming of Christ. Notice one thing here. The authors of this standard work opposed the giving of this message in its main feature. They called Babylon Babel, the city of Rome, the Catholic Church, and lastly the world. But those that had been burdened with this subject and felt the cry in them insisted upon it that these were mistaken, for Jesus had said, if any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine whether it be of God. and they knew perfectly well that they had not been to Babel, nor into the Catholic Church, nor to the city of Rome to preach this doctrine, and neither were they burdened to preach it to all the world, but to the organized churches where God's people were. It now began to be more clearly discerned that the standard work had not given the scriptural exposition of Babylon and her fall. For the mighty cry of these flying messengers with this second message began to make the nominal organized churches tremble to their foundations. At this crisis, another effort was put forth to check these disorganizers. Mr. Miller now came out with a different exposition, showing that Babylon would fall twice. First on the French Revolution in the 18th century, second in the final destruction of all things. It was clearly seen that this position, if followed, would preclude the necessity of the second and third messages that were to follow the first. In Revelation 14, verse 6 and 7, until the saints were immortalized. And yet, in other parts of the book, from which I shall quote by and by, he clearly showed that this was the time for the message, and it was actually being given. So I hope you understand what Joseph Bates is saying here, that in the time of the Millerite period, they were unclear even as to what this second angel message was, to who they were to give it. They understood the first angel's message, but when it came to the second angel's message and the third angel's message, they had no place really to place them. And they sometimes just placed them even earlier. They hadn't realized that when the second angel had arrived. Now, there were some people in that period who were understanding this. So I'm going to try to illustrate this. So not looking up here, even though we have that all up there, trying to zoom in here. We know that we have the Jewish year 1843. So we'll put 1843 here. So this is going to go from the spring, we'll just say March 21st to April 19th. And so this is in the fall, he says in the fall, so this is going to be the fall here. In the fall of 1843, the second angel's message began to be given, and it was that Babylon had fallen. Now, we know that Miller had also predicted that it was possible that the 2300 days would end in the fall of 1843, in the 7th month. So it's at this time that they're caught up in what they believe is the midnight cry. And they're also giving this call to come out of Babylon. Now, the close of probation for the Protestants is here. And the question is why? Why are the Protestants' probation closed here? And then we have to understand who this group is. Because we know the close of probation is over here on October 22nd. Right? So we're going to have a close of probation over here. But we have a close of probation here. And he says, though, that the second angel's message was given in the fall of 1843. So now we say that the second angel arrived here on April 19th. So if the second angel arrived here, would it be that he's or the people at that time are giving a message too soon? That is, they know they're in the first angel's message, and they begin to give the second angel's message. And the reason they're giving it is Protestants began to close their doors in 1842. Back here, they began to close their doors. And so we know that because they personally were being persecuted by the churches, that many of them started to see that the second angel's message applied also to the Protestants. And so when they were talking about Babylon has fallen, they say this includes Protestants. But he's saying that there was this confusion. Some people think it's just the world. It's a call to come out of the world. But some people are making this claim that it's the Protestant churches. He hasn't quite said that yet, but that's where he's going to go. Now, we know then that the door closes for the Protestants. Now, in Samuel Snow's letters, you remember there was his first letter was published in the Signs of the Times on April 3rd, 1844. So I say this is 1843, this is the Jewish year 1843. So just before the end of the Jewish year 1843, basically 16 days before, he publishes this for the second time, his first letter, and this is the false Passover. But we know his second letter is going to be published on May 2nd, and this is the true Passover. And this divides, this separation here between the false Passover and the true Passover is what distinguishes, because the Passover is about separation. And April 19th lies in the center of this. So in my understanding of this, those that accept the true Passover, that is, they're accepting the chronology that leads to this being of the 10th day of the 7th month, that is the test for them. If they believe that the prophecies have completely been fulfilled either by March 21st or April 19th, and they would actually have March 21st, that is, the people who are Protestants, they don't even recognize that this is the first day of the first month. And you can see why. Because in order to accept this is the first day of the first month, you must actually accept this message that this is the 10th day of the 7th month. So the Protestants who have the Passover as April 3rd, they would see September 23rd, 1844 as the Day of Atonement. And they would recognize nothing happened on that day. The Millerites aren't even proclaiming that day. They're proclaiming some other date. So there's this understanding that in order to accept the first angel's message completely, you would have to understand something. And the question is, what is that? The hour of God's judgment has come. If you've rejected that, by the time you get to April 19th, the first day of the first month, you've already rejected the message. So the Protestants have a test here on this side, which has to do with, one, it has to do with chronology. It has to do with the first angel's message, the hour of God's judgment has come. And they reject that idea. So when you get to April 19th, the Protestants are mocking the Millerites. Now, of course, the Millerites are on this side of April 19th. They're now going to recognize the first day they already did recognize the first day of the first month, but they're going to start to recognize that this is going to mark the 10th day of the 7th month. And that understanding for most of the Millerites is going to develop in this history. Samuel Snow already somewhat understands it way back, and I think even in the fall, he says that in the fall of 1843, when Miller was looking for the 7th month movement, Samuel Snow says that he started to think that maybe this is the next year. So Miller is looking for the fall of 1843, but Samuel Snow starts to begin looking for the fall of 1844 as the end of the prophetic periods. And he develops that understanding as time goes on. We know that by January 1st, he has decided, in January 1st, 1844, he's decided that he's going to give the message that Jesus is coming back in the fall and that he's not coming back in the spring. So obviously he had studied this previously. And I would think probably he accepted the 7th month, but when it passed in the fall of 1843, that he would have started looking to the fall of 1844. He would have felt compelled by Miller's arguments that the prophetic periods would end in the fall. And that's why he rejected the idea of them ending in the spring. But he had to develop that understanding in order to present that message. So we're dealing with this group of people, which we call the Protestants. And we know that if we're going to parallel this with our history, and we're just going to put this as 9/11, this is 1980, so this is not this year here, we're not paralleling it completely. But we have 9/11 here lining up with April 19th. And so the group of people here who fail at 9/11, who would they be? Who would we parallel with the Protestants? So we would generally just say that these are Seventh-day Adventists. So you got Protestants up here, and now you have Seventh-day Adventists. Now, in trying to parallel these, we run into some problems. So one is the Protestants, they fall away in this history and they become part of Babylon. Now, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is not Babylon. The Protestants never were God's denominated people. But the Seventh-day Adventist Church are God's denominated people. They're a different type of group than this. The Protestants, they come out of captivity to the Catholic Church. And the Protestant churches arise, and in 1798, they begin this work of evangelism of the world. They begin to do much more than they had ever done before, as far as missionary endeavors, the translation of the scriptures into all different kinds of languages. The foreign Bible societies are all formed, and God's word is spread like wildfire from 1798 all the way through the early 1800s. Now, if we're trying to parallel the Protestants here with Seventh-day Adventists, in 1989, we have no such event. We don't see that the Seventh-day Adventists coming out of any kind of spiritual darkness are arising and doing any kind of work. So I think this would be a mistake to try to parallel these two, Seventh-day Adventists and Protestants, even though we have done that. Now, this is just a suggestion. But I would say if this is a reform line, the Protestants are part of this reform line. The Seventh-day Adventists, as a body, they are not. They're not a part of this reform line. In fact, we know that in 1989, which is not paralleling here, but it's just going to put it here. In 1989, they are passed by, and we have a new group of people. And this new group of people, we would have to say are Seventh-day Adventists, but they are not the Seventh-day Adventists. It's a group of people within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, we could call it, and I'm just going to put it here, this is the present truth movement, if for lack of a better word. There's a group of people from 1989 who are present truth people. And now these are Seventh-day Adventists, but they're not the Seventh-day Adventist Church as an organization. These are Adventists who are looking for truth, who are studying, just like the Protestants are. And they're going to be going through an experience. Now, so when we try to make that this is the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you can see that the parallel breaks down for a number of reasons, because the Seventh-day Adventist Church is not going through a reform line here. So there is a group of people, but we could call it SDA's present truth movement. These people have been Seventh-day Adventists. There's this period of darkness in Adventism, and now a reform line is coming for Seventh-day Adventists. And it's supposed to reform Seventh-day Adventists. And in this history, I'm a part of this history, just like most Seventh-day Adventists are who were living here. We could see that there was, in 1988, definitely in 1989, this is the history where you really start to see Jones and Wagner being talked about. All kinds of ideas, all kinds of groups are forming. Prior to 1989, there is not really lots of independent ministries. There are some. Most of them are just Seventh-day Adventists who are doing some kind of medical work and so forth. But when you get into this history, you start to see an explosion of independent ministries happening in 1989, and some huge ones. Hope International, they start before this history, but it's really in this history here from 1989 onward that even though they were doing our Firm Foundation magazine and stuff earlier here, that this clash with the Seventh-day Adventist Church begins in a big way. And I can't remember the years here when there was a Issues magazine periodical, or it wasn't a periodical, it was in the Signs, a Review and Herald, that they put a smaller pamphlet, and then they actually had a big book called Issues, and they were addressing these present truth movements. But there was lots of these, Hope International, I can't think of the names of all these different groups, but there were some very, very big ones. But you see also in this period here, all kinds of ideas. A lot of it's focused upon prophecy. I know that in the year 2000, there was many groups that were saying that the world's going to come to an end. There was lots of different predictions regarding the end of the world. But all I'm saying that is, if we're going to look at it here, that there's going to be a reform, and present truth is going to have a revival. But there's lots of false and true mixed here. And you can see this in the Protestants as well. We always focus on the Millerites, but actually there was all kinds of reforms going on within Protestantism, all kinds of revivalist movements. There was all kinds of different religious groups that were developing and forming in this period that weren't mainline Protestant churches. And so you see this happening here, this parallel with the Protestants and the Seventh-day Adventists happening. Now, 9/11, as a waymark to try to parallel this with the close of probation, would be that you see that there are a group of people who come to accept that 9/11 is a fulfillment of prophecy. Many Adventists, initially when it happens, 9/11 occurs, a lot of people looked at Testimonies 9, page 11. It's called The Last Crisis or something like that. And they would recognize that this was a fulfillment of prophecy. But very quickly, that began to be less and less accepted, especially within conservative Adventist ranks. They began to reject this idea that 9/11 had a prophetic role. Definitely the Seventh-day Adventist Church on November 9th, 1989, did not accept this as prophetic. When 9/11 happened, and this is the way we would look at it, is that the Seventh-day Adventist Church organization had basically rejected this whole history. They had an opportunity here and an opportunity here. And that's why we would put Seventh-day Adventist Church here. But really, the Seventh-day Adventist Church isn't involved in this reform line. It's passed by here as regarding any new light. And the new light is now given to individuals who are not ministers, who are not part of the establishment. It's interesting that prior to 1989, in this period of darkness, and you could look all the way back to Lewis F. Weir, but there are people who are ministers who are writing books that have a lot of truth in it and that are pointing to basically the truths that we now understand, though they didn't understand them fully. But they're calling for this revival of understanding, going back to historic Adventism. But by 1989, that stops. You don't see ministers, very few, doing that kind of work. And if the organized church has basically shut that down. And a lot of that had to do with the rise of these present truth movements. So you will see here, I think particularly of Light Bearers Ministry, they actually join with the Seventh-day Adventist Church here. So I used to follow Light Bearers to some degree because I was friends with Ty Gibson. But when we get to 1989, Light Bearers has actually joined with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and they have rejected much of the messages that they had been giving prior to that. And they begin a work of presenting what we would call conservative Adventism, but it's not really the truth. So it's truth mixed with error. And so that's what we see happening, is we see there are these present truth movements, and we see a lot of fanaticism. So there's all kinds of health fanaticism, there's all kinds of righteousness by faith fanaticism going on in this history. And I'm involved in a organization as well in this time trying to do health work. Somebody have a comment? I heard somebody speak.
Just saying amen to what you said.
Oh, okay.
It's Brian.
Okay, so 9/11 changes things. That is, it's here that many people in the present truth movement either wake up or they stay asleep. So Seventh-day Adventists now start to understand some things, and we start to go back to prophecy, especially Future for America starts to evaluate after 9/11 the role of prophecy. Before that, we have the lines, and obviously we have the Sunday law coming. But we now start to see that there's more to the message than we'd ever seen before. So there now becomes an explosion of light. And if we're going to compare it to here, we could say that this is the tarrying time. From 9/11, this would parallel what happened on April 19th. Now, this is an empowerment of the first angel's message in our history, as well as the arrival of the second angel's message. So the second angel's message, which we're talking about here, is this message that Babylon is fallen. And that's the problem that we have here in this history, because we're not sure who Babylon is. It's the same problem that they're having in Millerite history, even though they start this here in the fall. They start to come up to understand that it's Protestants. If in our history, we start to recognize it's not just the Seventh-day Adventist Church that has been passed by, but that many conservative Adventist groups have been passed by. And we are joined, or Jeff is joined, after 9/11 with a number of different groups. And there's somewhat a type of unity that's going to happen in this history. But we know in 2014, so I'm just going to put it in here, 2014, we have the first departure of these groups from this message. And this is this apostasy that happened. If you're going to try to relate it to here, we would have some problems. And that's why we need to understand, because here in this history, in Millerite history, we know that there was fanaticism, but we don't see the Protestants and then the Millerites, and then we don't see big splits happening in the Millerites. We actually see a lot of unity. In our history, we had unity, but in 2014, something happened. And to try to relate it to this history is going to take a little bit of time, because I think we can relate it to this history. And I think we can specifically relate it to May 2nd. So even though May 2nd, I also connect with 2017. So I'm going to put this here. So you're going to see what I mean as time goes on, what this is. And this here, I end on 2017 for a reason, not 2019, even though we could extend it there, because this is when this was understood. Now, we're going to read some more about this history. I know I've kind of gone ahead, and hopefully this makes sense to people. So when we go on and read more about what Joseph Bates says about that history. So I kind of moved ahead past that, but we'll go back again. Subsequently, he came out again with his view of Revelation, talking about Miller, 14 verse 6 to 20, where he says, I regard the woman, or mystical Babylon, as the fallen church and all churches that have the papal spirit. But it just does not follow that there can be no churches that love the Lord in sincerity. And then Bates says, I wonder if there is such an organized church to be found. I think this globe will be searched in vain for it. He further says of the loud cry, the first waymark in Revelation 6:7, that it will continue until Christ comes in his kingdom. The second message in, I think he means chapter 8, verse 5, or verse 8, that's what he means, verse 8, 8th verse. The fall of Babylon will take place after Christ comes. And further, that the angel in 18, verse 1 to 2, which we call the fourth angel, is the Lord Jesus Christ descending from heaven to take the kingdom. So you can see that there's all this confusion regarding the second angel's message in Miller's understanding. And you can see why. He doesn't have a place for it. Now I'm going to skip a little bit ahead here, because he's going to start talking about the plagues and some of these other issues. I'm going to go here. For it was very evident that there were two processes for Babylon to pass through. After her fall, and God's people had come out of her, first, it's utterly burned with fire, and it would be found no more at all. About this time, August 1844, 10,000 extras of the Voice of Truth containing the editors, Samuel Snow and George Storrs' exposition were published, showing what was Babylon and her fall, etc., etc. Now, many people don't know that Samuel Snow and George Storrs, they began working together. And some people sort of, and I've had this discussion with some people, they believe that this was almost like a separate movement within the movement, that the established leadership, Miller and all these people, weren't really accepting what Snow and George Storrs were presenting. And I wouldn't take that position. I wouldn't go that far because there was a lot of freedom in this movement for people to present ideas. There wasn't a control at the top by Miller and Himes. They allowed all kinds of things to be published, even things they didn't agree with. So there wasn't really a need to there wasn't really an opposition. They weren't experiencing opposition for publishing these things. These were just parts of discussions that they were having in a very civil way. So there wasn't a party spirit going on in the movement at this time. So he's just talking about this publication, The Voice of Truth. This presented the subject in so clear a light and in accordance with the teachings of the Spirit that it was clearly seen that Babylon, that great city, symbolized by a woman seated upon a scarlet-colored beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns, representing the existing organized churches which had now fallen in consequence of rejecting the doctrine of the second advent of our Savior, which was now being given by the messengers that were flying through the midst of heaven, just as the Jewish church fell by the rejection of the first advent. And the beast with 7 heads. And okay, so I'm going to stop there. So I think you can see where I'm going with this. So if we're going to look at this here, Protestants, I got to share the screen. So if we're going to see these Protestants here, and we're going to see Millerites, I don't know why I put Protestants, Millerites here, we can see that there's this sharp distinction that we're trying to make here isn't really as sharp as you would make it. So even though we have Protestants here, we have Millerites here, we have present truth here, and what are we to call this group here? There's this separation that's happening. Now, the Millerites themselves are part of this group. So I'm going to put Millerites here. Millerites, especially in 1843, you have Millerites and Protestants. And the Millerites are Protestants for the most part. You don't really have a lot of Catholics that are Millerites. This is actually a Protestant revival. And if we're going to try to present here what this is in context with this, you would have a mixture of groups here. Now, even when we get here, we always make this sharp distinction that here is this close of probation for the Protestants, which I don't think is a problem, except there's still going to be many people here who are going to be rejecting the message as time goes on. That is, they may be Protestants, they may feel they're in the tarrying time, but not everybody who's in this history is going to be accepting the advanced light. Now, part of the thing is many people don't want to see that their churches have become Babylon. So not everybody's leaving the Protestant churches. But some people are being kicked out, so that makes it easy. But the call to come out of Protestantism isn't necessarily followed by everyone. And so this is not as clear-cut as we try to make it. The point that I'm making is that when we look here at this history and this history, these people here who leave in this history are actually leaving in a different context than we see it. That is, when I draw the line like this is actually a bit of a false line. So I'll try to illustrate this better. Because the question is 9/11 really where the probation closes? Even though we mark it here as the first day of the first month. So I'm going to write the first day of the first month, because that's April 19th. And if we look in our history, this might not make sense to people, but if we make this 9/11, and I'm not saying that the first day of the first month does not represent 9/11, but we know that the separation that happened in our movement, if we're going to look at this line as being our movement, that separation doesn't really happen at 9/11. That separation doesn't happen until 2014. Now, you saw some people presenting back in 2017 that this was a symbol that they called sunset. And they tried to parallel 2014 with sunset. Now, this was also about the prediction before midnight. So I'm going to confuse everybody here for a while, if that's okay. Because some of you don't know this history that well. Some of you do. But even if we do, we may not fully know how to look at it. So here's what happened. I'm going to try to explain this the best I can. So if we're going to do this, we're going to put this as 9/11. So 9/11 here. I don't know the best way to draw 9/11. I like to do it like this. But so you got 9/11, and we would say that this is the first day of the first month. But we know that 9/11 is also the arrival of the second angel. So this is the first angel is empowered. It's also the second angel arrives. But the separation of this movement, of this present truth movement, doesn't happen at 9/11. It actually doesn't happen until 2014. It's basically 13 years later. And we had marked this, the prediction before midnight, or when we lined it up with Samuel Snow's letters, we called it May 2nd. I don't know if that was necessarily correct, but this is part of the understanding that was happening. Now, I don't usually like to present wrong ideas because that can confuse people. But the thing is, sometimes wrong ideas have truths attached to them, but they're done in the wrong way because they also attach error. And so sometimes you have to look and try to discern where the error is and not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So in trying to make this symbol, sunset, which it can't be sunset, that would be a wrong application. But that was this idea that was being taught in 2017. So it looked at this 2014 as this sunset. It lined up with the prediction before midnight, which was being talked about in 2017. And May 2nd was being marked as the date in Samuel Snow's letters that symbolizes that. So this would then also be, as a symbol, this would be the Passover. And of course, you can see the first day of the first month is not the Passover. So you would then have to mark this as the 14th day of the first month in 2014. Right? So there was mixtures of ideas that were going on around here. When I say here, in this movement, of trying to understand that. And also here too, because this person came up to Alberta and presented the Psalm 23, and also did a presentation on sunset in a small community hall that I recognized was error as soon as I saw it. And the person claimed to be Samuel Snow, not in a direct way, but hinted at it. Because when I asked him, "Are you Samuel Snow?" he said, "Well, you're going to see," which, was, and I explained to him that, you can't be Samuel Snow because Samuel Snow doesn't represent a person. So I bring this up because we have this confusion. Now, when I look at Samuel Snow's letters, so I'm going to erase this because this isn't truth. And I'm just going to go back to Samuel Snow's letters here. So I'm going to erase all this, and then we'll come back to this. We can put this as, we'll put this again as April 19th. So he has this letter here on April 3rd, and he has this letter here, we'll put on May 2nd. And we can see that April 19th is the first day of the first month. But we can't mark anything in our history of these two groups separating on the first day of the first month if we make it 9/11. And this separation here that happens with the Protestants, and then you have the Millerites on this side, this separation, you can see that obviously in our history, if we're going to look at the separation that occurred in this movement, that occurred after. So there's this problem. And I brought this up to Jeff back in 2018. So in 2018, Elder Jeff was presenting Samuel Snow's letters. And we'd already gone through this experience in 2017. And I wrote him some emails and he responded back regarding this. And then I met him at the camp meeting and we talked about it there a little bit. But this idea of where we put these two groups, what I was doing in 2017 is I was looking at that this was a separation between the false priests and the true priests. Now, in 2017, we hadn't yet had a separation occur. That separation occurred at the end of it. So in 2017, I was presenting Samuel Snow's letters, and I was presenting this. This represents the separation of the true and the false priests. That this is 9/11 on the big line, but that this represented a separation within this movement itself. And we know that the next letter of Samuel Snow's was June 22nd. So his third letter, so you got his first letter, the last time it's published, his second letter, and then his third letter. And you're going to have the fourth letter as well, the July 18th letter. So in trying to sort this out, in trying to sort out who these groups were and who was being tested, this obviously couldn't apply to 9/11 if we're applying this to the false priests in our movement in 2014 who have left. And now in 2017, I was saying we've passed through this experience and now we have God's people on this side, and then the next is Pentecost, right? And I would recognize that this was the Passover. I'm kind of leaving out some details here, but this is a Passover and this is a Passover. This is the false, this is the true. And the true Passover, Samuel Snow's second letter is addressing 31 AD, the midst of the week. And we can see that there's in this Passover here, this is a chiasm. But there's another chiasm that exists at the cross. And that is you have the repentant thief and the unrepentant thief on either side of Christ. It's also a chiasm. It represents the two classes of workers. It represents those that are saved and those that are lost. And the other thing that we were looking at this time is the idea of midnight. And we know that Judas separated from the disciples, and it's at midnight that the mob comes and he kisses Christ. And so we saw that this Passover marks this separation between the true and the false. So I'm not sure how to present this because we have these wrong ideas, but there's some right ideas in there. So let's look again at Millerite history just here. We know that the time of the end is way over here. And we come into this period, which they call the Midnight Cry. And they would actually start it on August 11th, 1840. So we're going to go back here. So they know that the message has been empowered here. And they're going to be giving this Midnight Cry. And especially as they get closer and closer to the end of the Jewish year 1843, they believe that they've given the Midnight Cry. When Jesus doesn't come back by April 19th, they're disappointed. And so they have to figure out what to do. So they come to understand that they're in the tarrying time. Now, this isn't the first time that they understood they were in the tarrying time. And that's part of the problem, in that when they first had the date 1843, and they started to see that there was, that the chart was wrong. So they recognized this mistake on the 1843 chart that I have over here on my left, that they realized the chart was wrong. They didn't realize the chart was wrong here. They realized the chart was wrong in 1843, and actually very early in 1843, maybe even in late 1842. That is, Miller came to understand that the year 1843 didn't go from December to December, right? Or January to January. But he realized that this was the Jewish year, 1843, that went from spring to spring. The reason that they came to this conclusion was because they started to recognize that there was no 0 year. And this was a correction of that. So part of the idea, and this may seem odd because so many of us are taught that it's on the first disappointment that they realized the mistake on the chart. But it wasn't then that they recognized the mistake. They recognized it about a year before or more. So they recognized the mistake on the chart. And they were in the tarrying time early on, because even on January 1st, 1843, many people believed that Jesus was going to come back because they now were in the Jewish year, or they're in the year 1843. But then they had to recognize that they had to tarry. And so even though they had made this chart in 1842, they didn't recognize the mistake until shortly after. And that meant that they were tarrying. So even when they're tarrying to April 19th, they believe that they're tarrying. They believe because of the mistake that Miller made, that's why they have to wait all the way till April 19th, 1844, because the bridegroom has tarried. But then they believe that they're giving the midnight cry, and that midnight cry has to do with the fact that they're now proclaiming the coming of Christ in the year 1844, not the year 1843. So this isn't well understood. Very few Adventists know this. Even people in this message don't know this, that the tarrying time would have been in a loose way from January 1st, 1844 to April 19th, 1844, because that was a tarrying. The vision that they originally had was the year 1843, January 1st to December 31st. So Samuel Snow, of course, recognized this before, but they still believe that they were in this tarrying time, and it would just go tarrying to the spring. But then when they get here, they don't know what to do because Miller's prophecies have completely failed. So now they're going to be in this tarrying time here. Now, in trying to relate this to our line, so this is the problem. We say that we're going to repeat Millerite history to the very letter. Now, Ellen White actually says that the parable of the 10 virgins would be repeated to the very letter. Now, and I say that not to say that we're not repeating Millerite history, because we are. But in order to understand how we're repeating Millerite history, we need to understand the parable of the 10 virgins better, because we know that they had a false apprehension of it, because they believe they're in the tarrying time, which comes from the parable of the 10 virgins. But then later to realize, no, that they weren't in the tarrying time until here. Now, the repeat of the Millerite history comes from different ideas, all the details of Millerite history. It doesn't really come from the parable of the 10 virgins, because we can show that we repeat Millerite history without any reference to the parable of the 10 virgins. So I'm trying to figure out how I can get to the next part of this. Now, hopefully people can understand the difficulties, because what I've showed the difficulties, that we're unclear of who the groups are in Millerite history, and we're definitely unclear of how we're going to apply them into our history, and that we can see that we can't just make this simplistic, straight connection where we make this 9/11 and we just have that separation happen here, and then at the close of probation, we're going to have the other separation. Because we've had in this movement, we've had a separation that we looked at prophetically. So the way that we came to address this is, I think, rather complicated. So we know we have 1989. So we have this time of the end, we have 9/11. And what we did is we created a thing called the line of the priests, and the line of the Levites, and the line of the Nethinims, and the line of the 144,000. And so we would take these lines as fractals and lay them over top of each other. And what we would do, and I'm not, I'm showing you the problems, and then we can maybe figure out the solutions. But what we did is we said the line of the priests has their time of the end here, and this is their 9/11, right? So this is their their waymark, which we would call the arrival of the second angel's message. And then we could take events in the line of the priest, like 2014, 2018. So this would be, if we're going to parallel this with Millerite history, this is the way it was done. This is 1798. This is both August 11th, 1840, and April 19th. And then we would say that 2014 is going to be midnight. And then 2018 was the midnight cry. And then this is going to be followed by the Sunday law. This is followed by the Sunday law. So we just call it the Sunday law, whenever this is. So this would be, now we would say 2021, let's say. Okay, so these are the lines, and this is the line the way that we had it. Now, of course, we would say that this is then the close of probation, because if we're lining this up with Millerite history, this is October 22nd, 1844. But we would say this is the line of the priests. And so 2014 was based upon, connecting 1863 with 1989 by 126 years, represented by the 126 shekels, and 1888 being connected by 126 years to 2014. And then also 1863 being connected with 151 shekels, using a different measure of the manna. So many of you are familiar with that, not everybody is. But the point is, 2014 was supposed to be a Sunday law, but it wasn't, right? Now, of course, this really confused the lines, because we then would have to argue that in Millerite history, I'll put it like this, I'll just go, Sunday law, close of probation, we'll do it this way. In Millerite, so this is the priests themselves. Now, we could actually even here, I'm just going to extend this even more, because this is probably more correct of how it was understood. This is the second coming. Well, we'll put it here. Second coming, this is the second coming. And then this here is the close of probation. And if you're going to put it as the close of probation, you would put this as November 9th. So this is obviously going back to what was being taught in late 2018 and into 2019 by the new movement. So this was the close of probation. And then this would be typified by Raphia. And this would be Paneum. And Paneum would be the second coming in the line of the priests. Now, of course, when you look at this line, so this is what they taught as the line of the priests. And we compared it with Millerite history, we would then put this as 1863. But none of this is real. That is, there is no Sunday law in 2014. In 2018, this is October 13th, but they put October 3rd, but I'll put October 13th. So this is the midnight cry. This is paralleling the midnight cry, where we're calling about the close of probation. And so in 2018, they say, well, this was midnight, 2014, and this symbolizes the Sunday law. So in Millerite history, they would have to make July 21st the Sunday law. They'd have to make August 15th would be paralleling this. And then this close of probation, October 22nd, would parallel November 9th. Now, it's very compelling when you do this argument in the way that they looked at it at the time. But we know that there was some false ideas here. So one is to try to make this a Sunday law. Really, this is a period of rebellion. That's what's happening here. Now, if we look at Millerite history then, and we try to say what happened at midnight, we know that in this history there was a lot of fanaticism. From April 19th, we have all this fanaticism coming into Adventism. Many people are vying for all these different views. trying to reinterpret the prophecies. All kinds of stuff's happening. And we know, though, that this is happening here in this movement. We start to see this fanaticism. We're just not aware of it. What happened in this movement is we have this new movement developing within the movement that was teaching fanaticism, teaching lots of errors. And so when they get here and they believe that they've given the midnight cry, they're wrong. Their message here is wrong about what's happening here. So we have to sort through this mess. And now the next thing that they're going to do is that, and I know I've been talking for a long time. I'm just going to see how much time we have here. So it's 1 o'clock. I've been talking for almost 2 hours. Anybody have questions about this? Does this make sense that it doesn't make sense?
I guess I have a question.
Okay.
I guess it seems to make sense, and also I'm just, just open to seeing where you're going at the same time. But one thing I would say is that it seems as though, and I just let me get 1 minute to speak. It seems as though you would be considered to be presenting ideas that are contrary to what Jeff may be teaching publicly at this very moment in some instances, and not cause for concern. But the concern that I have is why don't the teachers, the people who are leading and presenting, get together and kind of get these ideas out on the table and go back and forth? Why is that such a hard thing for the movement to do? I've tried to put that on the table, but I don't understand the concept behind that. But I think that when I listen to what you're sharing, and then I go and I see what Jeff is sharing, it would seem like it's contradicting on some very core structural points. And I'm not concerned for the different teaching. I think that that's supposed to be there, but because it helps people to study. But why are we not getting together, or the teachers getting together and trying to be of one voice? Because it's going to be very confusing to the people who are looking on to have to take sides between anybody.
Well, the way that I would look at it is, I don't think that I'm sharing something different. I'm trying to look back. I'm just trying to tear this apart and put it back together. So I'm being very analytical about stuff that happened. Jeff and I have had conversations regarding this very stuff, dealing with trying to understand this. Now, what I think that's happening, as far as I'm concerned, is that many people aren't as concerned about it, maybe as I am, just for the simple reason that we sort of know where we're going. And our message is not really about these lines in the way that they were taught. Our message is about Daniel 11. That's our message. That's the message that we're going to give to the Levites. So this is something for us to understand. But I think that the problem that it has arisen for many people is we went through this history and we're all confused. And even though Jeff, I think, is presenting the truth, I don't think people really appreciate what he's presenting. That is, because they have so many mixed up ideas, that the same language means different things to different people. And I think that's the problem. And I think the lines that we have right now that Jeff is presenting are correct lines. Now, there's some minor differences, but they're not major, because one is, who are the Nethinim? But there's also another problem, and that problem has never really been dealt with. And that's just the thing is who we are. Who are we who are giving this message right now? And what I can show is that the lines as they were taught by Parminder were partly true and partly false. Jeff knows this, but he's not spending his time sorting through all of that. He's just sort of using what was given and using it correctly. But that doesn't mean that everybody else is understanding it. And so when we go back to Millerite history, I'm just being very particular. That's all. I'm just being more particular than most people would be regarding statements like, we're going to repeat Millerite history to the very letter, knowing that Ellen White says that we're going to repeat the parable of the 10 virgins to the very letter. Now, you could just say parable of 10 virgins is Millerite history, so we're going to repeat that history. But we know that there are differences in our history and that history. One is that we combine the empowerment of the first angel and the arrival of the second angel with one waymark where they exist as two. So we know there's differences. And people have argued against this movement because we weren't consistent. That is, they said, we're not doing this consistently. And then we had somebody come along and saying, here's how we do it, and we're going to be consistent. But yet he was just as inconsistent as everybody else was. Actually, he was so inconsistent that he basically threw it all away. Everything that he said that he was teaching, he wasn't. So he was trying to support, because when we had this, and you weren't in the movement at the time, but in 2017, when we had this idea that 2014 was sunset, the champion who came to attack that was Parminder. And he showed that this was weakening 9/11, but yet Parminder went and did exactly the same thing that was being done with 9/11 that he criticized. And so he did it so cleverly, for lack of a better word, is that he made it look like he was upholding 9/11. But as he drew these lines of the priests, the Levites, the Nethinims, and the 144,000 in 2018 at the Italian camp meeting, he actually completely undermined 9/11. And he did it without us knowing it. And we didn't realize it until much later, until 2019, in the fall of 2019, that we even realized what he had done. And so this is my point. If we're going to understand Millerite history and our history, we need to recognize that we have a lot of wrong ideas. And some of them are mixtures of truth and error. But the thing is, the error is what's getting in the way. It's clouding up the line. So as I start to draw these out, you can start to see that there's these problems. And so these problems, for me, they need to be resolved. And the way that I resolve them is trying to understand who the groups of people are. So let's just jump ahead. Here's where I'm going. We know that Samuel Snow is not an individual. We're not supposed to be looking for some person that Samuel Snow typifies. So we're not looking for an anti-typical Samuel Snow. Samuel Snow's message is a message. And that message can be defined as July 18th. Right? That's his message. From February 16th in 1844 to July 18th. And he has these different waymarks in his letters, right? He has February 22nd. So he writes it, he publishes it the first time, and then it's published the second time on April 3rd. And then we know that he's going to, after the first day of the first month, he's going to publish his second letter, May 2nd. And then we know that he's going to have a third letter, June 22nd. Now, what I came to understand in 2017 was this was a chiasm. So this was 2 months and 16 days, 2 months and 16 days. And there's a lot of symbolism in this that we now understand that we didn't. For instance, 216 is 6 times 6 times 6. This number here shows up again and again in our history. And I knew it was showing up in chronology over and over. I didn't know what it meant, but I understand what it means now. Because this is a message about Islam. And 666 also represents Islam, not just the papacy, not just Babylon or pagan Rome. It also represents Islam. And so we know that the message here, even though May 2nd is the center, it's the key that unlocks the chiasm, the important date is the last date, the last letter in Samuel Snow's letters. So this we would call the prediction before midnight, because it's 3 days before July 21st. Now, if we're predicting the prediction before midnight, that means midnight hasn't come yet. Right? Because July 18th comes before July 21st. So there must be something wrong with our understanding of the lines. And that's because we've broken down our fractals in such a manner that we're not aware of where we are in the big stream of time. Now, we would look at midnight, we would have looked at it as Raphia, because midnight is a line in the line of the Levites, and Raphia would have been November 9th. And so then we say, well, maybe Raphia is now July 18th. We're going to apply it to July 18th. Well, but if July 18th is the prediction before midnight, how do we do that? We could say that our message is about July 18th, and that's what the prediction before midnight is, and that July 18th then is midnight. And that's possible. I'm not arguing against that. All I'm saying is that this group who is presenting this message, they are typified by Samuel Snow. And we have said that these are the priests. Now, we know that this is Snow, and we know that Ezekiel also typifies Snow. Now, the message that we're giving about July 18th is based upon Josiah Litch. So if we go back here, we have August 11th, 1840, and we have Litch's message. Now, we can take Litch's message and lay it over top, and we could try to argue that Litch is also typifying Snow, though I don't do that, because I would say that you got Josiah that Ezekiel uses, and you got Josiah that Snow uses. So Ezekiel and Snow are both basing their prophecies upon an understanding that has come from Josiah. Ezekiel uses King Josiah, Samuel Snow uses Josiah Litch. So these two are connected. So I don't put Ezekiel as Josiah, the King Josiah, and I don't put Samuel Snow as Litch, as Josiah Litch. So these are using an existing prophecy or a message. Now, King Josiah was to do a work of reform. So he began a work of reform, but he failed that work of reform. Now, Josiah Litch is part of the Millerite movement, and he's a part of a line of reform. And that line of reform is under the first angel's message, because his message is actually the empowerment of the first angel's message when that event is fulfilled. So in trying to understand who these Josiahs represent, this Josiah would represent, and I would put Josiah Litch in some ways connected with Miller, because he just empowers Miller's message. So this really is Miller, right? If you want to look at it, this is all about the first angel's message. It's a better way to look at it. This is about the first angel's message. And we can see that Josiah's reform happened between 677 and 607. He died 2 years before Daniel's captivity. But Ezekiel is going to use this prophecy of Josiah to predict an event in the future. And that event is the 10th day of the 5th month. Now, Snow, this comes from here. So this is his message. Now, Snow is going to be predicting, of course, the 10th day of the 7th month. But we know that the symbol of his line here is July 18th, because that's this symbol here, July 18th. Now, what isn't known, so we're not getting very far here today, but I just want to leave you with an idea that is not well understood about this message. And that has to do with June 22nd and the relationship between June 22nd and July 18th. So I guess you can see this, but I'm just going to put this down a bit more. When I discovered July 18th, 2020, this was a result of taking this symbol, the 10th day of the 5th month, from Ezekiel. And this July 18th was a Julian date, but it was also a Gregorian date, July 31st. But in Millerite, in Ezekiel, when I'm looking at this date, this is a Gregorian date, right? This happens on Gregorian dates. And so, or Julian dates, pardon me. So when I looked at this, I put it as a Julian date because the Julian date, July 18th, is the 10th day of the 5th month. Now this symbol, July 31st, is an important symbol because July 31st represents the week of Christ with 31 AD in the middle. We did this study dealing with the 70 weeks and the 70th week. And so July 31st is also a symbol of the crucifixion of Christ or of that prophetic mirror. So we have July 18th. Now what ended up happening, the first time I presented July 18th publicly at the School of the Prophets, it was an evening, I remember that. What I did is I counted backwards from here 391.5 days. And I came to this date, June 22nd. Now, of course, I had this as 2020, but I wasn't really trying to go back from 2020 and give any significance to this date, June 22nd. I just took this date and I counted, because this is the date of the destruction of Jerusalem, and it's 391 years from the beginning of the divided kingdom. So I counted 391 days before here, and I came to this. Now, this, of course, is Samuel Snow's third letter, right? So this is his fourth letter, and so I put his third letter there. Now, in doing this, I was lining this up. Here, I'm going to erase this and put this above here. What I was doing is I was paralleling this. This is November 9th, 2019. To me, the prediction before midnight was about this date, November 9th, 2019. And that I was going to make a prediction before November 9th, 2019, about what was going to happen in the future, past November 9th. One of the reasons this was rejected is people taught, for no good reason, that you couldn't make a prediction beyond November 9th. And the only reason they had really is they didn't want anybody else making predictions. So they shut down this prediction, July 18th, by saying you couldn't make a prediction past November 9th. But if you look at all their arguments, they're all faulty. So anyway, when I made this prediction the first time, so this is before I have the July 18th Gregorian date. This is just when I first had July 18th. What I was doing is I was paralleling these two. I was going to October 13th, 2018, because this is 391.5 days. But when I did this and I counted backwards from this date, and I got June 22nd, it unfolded in a way that we never saw before, that we could see this parallel. And this parallel is, if I go back to February 16th and February 22nd and April 3rd and April 19th and May 2nd, and if I put all these dates here, and I go to October 13th, and I go from June 9th to June 15th, and then we know that there was this prediction made on July 27th that the midnight cry would be given on October 13th. And then we found that this was the center of a chiasm, where August the 11th was the center, and that I could put the August 11th, the Julian date, down here. That what I actually had was the same structure or a template from Samuel Snow's letters that lined up with this perfectly. You got these 6 days here. From August 11th to August 11th is 13 days. From April 19th to May 2nd is 13 days. And so what I could do is I could make April 19th the center of a chiasm, of 63 days and 63 days. So this chiasm didn't exist in our minds until we found July 18th. We had another chiasm with May 2nd in the middle. Now, there are differences here. One of the differences is some of these counts are ordinal and some are cardinal, but that's part of the structure of this prophecy. And, you know, this is, if you go into here, this would be April 19th in our history as well. So April 19th lines up with May 2nd. But we can see then that everything here, this lines up with June 19th, this lines up with February 22nd, this lines up with July 27th. April 19th lines up with August 11th. May 2nd lines up with August 11th, Julian. And June 22nd lines up with October 13th. So I say this because what we fail to recognize is, and we have done studies on June 22nd, we need to know what June 22nd represents, because this represents something about this movement. And that's the part that we've failed to understand. So if we start to look at these structures more closely, so this is what we're going to have to do next time. So I'm not going to be able to finish this time. I've just basically confused everybody. But what we can see is that July 18th is related to June 22nd, which is Pentecost, just as November 9th was related to October 13th, 2018. This has the same relationship. And we need to understand, because we're making this prediction about July 18th, but we don't understand who it is that's making this prediction. And that's what we can see when we get to this symbol, June 22nd. We can start to recognize who it is that's making this prediction. Because this isn't a person, and I don't even think that you can say it's the priests. I think we have to say that it's some other, this is a different message. This is the prediction before midnight. That's what this is. And maybe it's not even so much about who's giving it, but is what this means, what this July 18th means in the context. And to understand what November 9th meant in the first place, we need to understand what July 18th means in this context. So we're now connecting November 9th and July 18th. Now we know in our history that July 18th Gregorian is 252 days past November 9th. Right? So this is July 18th on the Gregorian calendar.
Amen.
But we know that there's also this other July 18th that exists another 13 days after. That's July 31st. And that's the 10th day of the 5th month, while this is the 26th day of the 4th month. And we haven't well defined why there are these two separate July 18ths. Right? This one's July 18th and July 31st. Right? And I think that in understanding this, we know that this is connected with November 9th. But we need to know why. And I don't know if I have the complete answer to that. Because I think that this is pointing to something that we don't fully understand, because I don't fully understand it. And if I don't fully understand it, because I'm the guy who sort of developed this, then that means there's a lack of understanding probably with everyone else. Now maybe somebody has an understanding or an explanation, but we're pointing to this July 18th here, but we have this other July 18th. And so we need to understand, and this is what we're going to do next time. We're going to try to understand what this June 22nd is and how it relates in Millerite history and how it relates to identifying who we are. Because I think this tells us who we are. And who we are this people giving this message. But we need to know who we are. Why are we giving this message? And to understand that, we need to understand Samuel Snow's letters, and we need to understand the history of this movement. So that's as far as I can go, because if I start to go beyond that, it would take way too long. Now, Chuck says, his tongue is stuck to the roof of his mouth. So he's always very colorful and metaphoric. I have no idea what he's talking about. But anyway, that's any final questions on this, because I'm not gonna resolve this right now. But any final comments or observations regarding this, what was presented?
Well, I can see that you're playing the role of the dirt brush man, and we really need to join in with you.
Right, we need to play the role of the dirt brush man. I mean, Christ is the dirt brush man from William Miller's.
Right.
But I believe that God is revealing this stuff to us. So he's really the dirt brush man. But we need to spend time uncovering the dirt and the rubbish and the counterfeit jewels that were put upon and mixed in with the precious jewels. So for those that don't know it, William Miller's second dream, he had a dream about the casket and with all these jewels and coins and gold and stuff in it. And these were scattered by careless people who came in, and they were covered up with dirt and rubbish. And then Christ comes in, the dirt brush man, and cleans them up and puts them in a larger casket, and they shine, can't remember how many times brighter, 10 times brighter, I think it is, than the previous casket. And
That's right.
yeah, so we have all this dirt and rubbish even within this message. And Chuck has about the chiastic structure that exists after July 18th, which he has a comment on that. But we'll deal with some of those ideas later on. What I do know is that we are predicting to July 18th, and we have this other structure. But this other structure is telling us things that we're not listening to. And even this structure here, I don't think there's many people who know this, because some people have seen me present it, but I know of no one else who has presented this. This was the thing that convinced Jeff about July 18th in the first place, because he had been presenting Samuel Snow's letters. And when he saw how July 18th showed this chiastic structure in Samuel Snow's letters that paralleled this, he was then convinced. And then we had the July 18th Gregorian date that was shown like the next week. We'd figure that out. And then Jeff started teaching July 18th, but it got shut down. And it got shut down at a point where we could have been developing some of these ideas and understanding this. Ever since 2017, I've been trying to get people to understand Samuel Snow's letters. And Jeff was presenting them, and he got them in 2018 and started presenting them. But we've gone away from Samuel Snow's letters, and I think it's the key to understanding Millerite history and also our history. So thanks everyone for participating. Our time is up, but where's the best place to find Samuel Snow's letters? So on academia.edu, you can find, or if you have, all of his letters are in the Three Angels Messages source book under the chapter, The Midnight Cry. So in that chapter, all of his letters are collected. Presentations on Samuel Snow's letters, the simplest one is if you go to Lambert Church, they still have the videos up. They took down all the bad videos, but my videos are still there. And if you go to September 23rd, 2017, I present Samuel Snow's letters. And then also at that time, at the School of the Prophets in 2017 in September, I presented Samuel Snow's letters. That's on the School of the Prophets website. So if you go to the School of the Prophets and you go to the earlier videos, my videos are all still up there from 2017. And I go through the book of Ezra, but the last few presentations are on Samuel Snow's letters. I go through some of the letters there as well. And there are other places, if you type in Samuel Snow's letters and my name, they'll show up other places where they were presented. But those are something that we need to understand. We need to understand Samuel Snow's letters. And I know there's a few comments here in the chat. Yeah, so, and there's lots of things that we're probably missing out on. I'm just gonna, just because people wrote these things down, and once I stop it, I think they sort of disappear. Somebody says we're all in jeopardy of falling away if for even one day we fail to commit ourselves to him. Fall even one potentially addictive sin from which we fail to repent. Yeah, and it's important to follow Christ every day, to be obedient to 100%. She asks, I keep hearing the Jewish year 1843, but according to JVP and others, 2020 is the Jewish year 5780. So when I say the Jewish year, all I'm saying is that the Jewish year lines up with our years. So Jewish years, their count is obviously incorrect. It has a much shorter period between, for the Persian period, they cut 100 and some years off. So there's just 177 years ago. I'm not sure if I understand Angela's comment there. Chuck says silence is golden. Yeah, well, I think he's probably telling me to stop talking. But anyway, there's this chiastic structure that exists after July 18th, which Chuck wants to talk about. And he says I need to check roof of the mouth in a Bible search. Psalm 37:10 is a key verse, Angela says. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, the tongue cleaves to the roof of my mouth, I cannot speak. But Christ says that, Psalm 22. So anyway, let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for the time that we've had here today. Even though it's been a difficult time, looking at a difficult topic, and trying to sort through this, we know that we need to know this message, the second angel's message. We need to know what it means to come out of Babylon. We need to know who it's directed at. And we need to know who we are if we're giving this message. There's so many issues and ideas that we have to address and that we don't fully understand. I pray that you can help each person who's been participating in these studies and who's watching these videos, that you can lead them and guide them in answering these questions that we don't have answers to. Help them to study and to search for truth and to be empowered by that study of prophecy, that they can also live a Christian life. Help us, Lord, forgive us for our sins and the way that we have misrepresented you throughout our lives. Help us to trust in Christ, to receive his righteousness each day. And we ask, Lord, that you can be with each person here. Help us to set aside self and to have your will and your purposes be the things that motivate us. Thank you for this study, for hearing our prayer, and we thank you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thanks, everyone. I have to go because I got things to do.
Yep.
So
Thank you,
thank you
Theodore.
all. And if you have any questions, people can always email me. I do have some of you emailing me. I haven't had much time to answer all the emails. I've got quite a few, but I will try to get to all of them. And,
Thanks, Theodore. When are you back on, Theodore?
Thank you.
Well, on Thursday morning
Okay.
at 11 o'clock Mountain Daylight Time. So
Thank you.
11, that would be
Thank
1
you.
o'clock Eastern Time and noon at Central Time. So thanks,
Okay.
everyone. I appreciate it. Participation. I know there's a lot of people. I never heard from Stephen really much, but I know he's probably thinking about everything I said and probably has some things he could write me and correct me about. Usually does. So thanks, everyone. God bless.
Thanks,
And,
you.
I'll see
You
some
too.
of you on Thursday.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Yep, bye.